Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is a joint workshop of the City Council and the Planning Commission for July 16th. And I'll call the meeting to order right at 4 o'clock. And can we get a roll call, please?
Yes. Commissioner Cueva? Commissioner,
Sorry.
oh, go ahead.
Present.
Thank you. Commissioner Smith stated he would be absent this evening. Commissioner Garai? Vice Chair Southard?
Here.
Chairman Cooley?
Here.
Councilmember Martinez?
Here.
Councilmember White?
Here.
Councilmember Voigt?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Lara?
Here.
Mayor Fenn?
Here, thank you. Do we have any public comments?
I have no written requests. Rudy, do we have any callers on the line?
I have no callers on the line.
All right, thank you. So item C1 is a Joint Planning Commission City Council workshop regarding the zoning code update, Plan 2024-0068, our capital improvement project, CIP CD-04. And so we'll hear a staff report by Ms. Carol Kendrick.
Good evening, Mayor, Council, Chairman, and Planning Commissioners. Carol Kendrick, Interim Community Development Director, presenting the first Joint Planning Commission City Council workshop on the zoning code update. Just to give you a little background, the city's zoning code is an implementation tool for the city's general plan. It provides regulations for residential, commercial, industrial projects, including lot sizes, setbacks, height requirements, densities. It's really the guiding tool for development. It has not been comprehensively updated since 2007. We have done kind of piecemeal updates as state regulations are updated or minor changes to address new changes in development. So we wanted to do, as part of our general plan update that was adopted in 2021, to update the zoning code, do a comprehensive update. On November 21st of 2023, the City Council awarded a contract to Lisa Weiss Consulting. That project, the zoning code update, is consistent with target number 5, goal number 1, to create design guidelines, and target number 3, goal 6, to revisit the city's municipal codes and zoning. And it is part of Capital Improvement Project CIP CD-04. The purpose of this joint Planning Commission work study, Planning Commission City Council work study, is to review the recommendations report and provide comments to staff. So at this time, I am pleased to introduce Stefano Riccici from Lisa Weiss Consulting to present the background review and recommendations. And I am available for any questions you might have.
Thank you.
Great.
All right,
Thanks.
Stefano, there you go.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, council members and commission members here. Let me go ahead and share my my slide deck here. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes, sir.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, so just backing up. So as Carol mentioned, my name is Stefano Riccici. I am the project manager for this zoning code update. So we're very happy to be here with you all tonight. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. As you know, Carol Kendrick is the project manager on the city side of things. She's also joined by Jillian Fountain and Katie Jensen, assistant planners there with the city. And then I'm joined with Jen Murillo, a director at Lisa Weiss Consulting, and Andrew Davidov as well. So in terms of the agenda for tonight, I'm going to start with the presentation, but really, excuse me, really what we want is we want to hear from you all, council members, commissioners, members of the public that have attended as well. We want to hear feedback from you on your thoughts on the recommendations that we've put together, and your thoughts on the zoning code as well. So again, I'll start with the presentation, but really we're here to listen to you all. And then at the end of my presentation, I'll talk about just next steps to get us wrapped up. So this is the schedule for our project. We're here at the first workshop or study session here with the Planning Commission and City Council. And again, this kind of kicks off the project here with you all and gets us started taking a look at the public review draft of the recommendations report that we've put together. So that has been included as part of your packet. Then moving forward into the winter and the spring, at the turn of the year there, we'll come back to you for another study session or workshop. At that point is when we'll talk about the zoning code and zoning map, edits that we are proposing to the zoning code and zoning map to get your input and feedback as well. Then after that, we'll prepare a hearing draft, zoning code and map. We'll come back to you for another workshop, or study session. And then ultimately, about a year from now, we anticipate having hearings with you all, with the Planning Commission and the City Council. And that's when we would anticipate adoption of this update to the zoning code and zoning map. So again, we're moving kind of at a quick pace here, but in about a year or so, we intend to come back to you for adoption. So again, today is kind of the introduction. We're going to talk about the recommendations report, and then in spring 2025 is when we'll come back to you with the code and the map. Okay, so let's get into the report. So the purpose of the recommendations report and the purpose of, as Carol was talking about, the zoning code update, more generally, there are different goals that we have here. So one of the things we want to do is we want to make the code more user-friendly. So that's both for staff who's administering the code and for members of the public, right? So that they can understand the code more easily and submit applications and that things can move smoothly. Otherwise, another goal that we have here is we want to ensure consistency both within the code itself, and then we want to ensure consistency with other policy documents that the city has, including, as Carol mentioned, the city's general plan that was adopted just a few years ago. Otherwise, we want the code to be streamlined, make it more succinct. Codes have a tendency to grow over time and become unwieldy, right? So we want to cut the fluff as much as we can in the code. And then lastly, we know that a priority for the city is for us to come up with industrial and commercial design standards. So I'm actually from the Inland Empire myself. I know that there are different warehouses that have gone in. I know Amazon's around, things like that. So we want to make industrial buildings and commercial buildings too, but as aesthetically pleasing or have the least amount of adverse aesthetic impacts on neighbors as well. So as I mentioned, part of this project, what we're doing is we are ensuring consistency and implementing various policy documents such as the general plan. So that's typical for us at Lisa Wise Consulting, and typical in planning. City planning generally is city adopts a general plan, updates their general plan, and then it's the zoning code that needs to be updated to reflect those updates to the general plan, because as you all probably know, the zoning code is what implements the general plan, right? Otherwise, the housing element, there have been updates to the zoning code in light of the update to the housing element that happened over the last couple of years. So a lot of those zoning code amendments have been made, but there are a few others that we will make through this zoning code update process. Also on the screen there, you have the parking management master plan that was completed within the last few years. So we're looking, of course, parking is always a big part of zoning codes, right? It's important. We want to get that right. So we took recommendations from that. And then lastly, we did look at the economic development strategic plan. So these are all different policy documents that we are looking to implement through zoning and ensure consistency with. Similarly, as I'm sure you all are very well aware, we have to be consistent with state law and federal law. So on the screen there, accessory dwelling units, right? The law regarding accessory dwelling units has been changing quite a bit over the last almost 10 years or so. Other things that we need to be consistent with, particularly state law on, are cottage food operations, daycares, different things like that, are what we're looking at here when we're looking at the zoning code. And then in terms of the organization or the structure of the recommendations report. We started off talking about how we propose to organize the code, zoning districts, and then we get into uses. We'll also talk about, or we also talk about in the recommendations report, development and design standards and administration procedures. So that's what I'll cover here next. In terms of code organization, of course, we want to organize things so that they're logical and in a place that makes sense. We want to consolidate and reorganize sections as appropriate. And actually, we have put together an administrative draft table of contents that we're currently working with, that staff's reviewing right now, and that shows exactly how we propose to organize the zoning code in a way that, again, is logical and makes sense. Otherwise, we want to use tables as much as possible. The current Beaumont zoning code does use tables quite a bit, so we want to continue to do that. And then we also want to, as shown on the slide there, incorporate the graphics, right? Those a picture, is worth 1,000 words there. So here we just have a graphic that shows how to understand building height there. So those are different things that we want to do code organization wise. In terms of recommendations for zoning districts, a lot of what this is again, general plan consistency. So for instance, updating the densities in downtown specifically, where we have cases of the single family residential zone and the traditional neighborhood zone as well. We want to update those densities to be consistent with the underlying land use designation. Similarly, for the manufacturing zone, we want to include a floor to area ratio, and that is reflected in the underlying general plan land use designation that the manufacturing zone is consistent with. Otherwise, some general plan land use designations have different heights that they set forth, and so we want the zoning districts to be consistent with those heights as well. These are just a couple of edits here. This Mountain View apartments here, the zoning district is not consistent with the underlying general plan land use designation again, so we want to make sure that's consistent. And then similar to the rest of the school site at San Gorgonio Middle School, we recommend updating the zoning to public facilities and designating that property as public facilities as well. Again, those are kind of more minor issues, but these are just some consistency items that we found in our review. And then besides the base zoning districts in terms of overlay zones, we want to map those, right? So this is downtown here. A lot of this is related to the housing element. And so both that housing sites overlay and the higher density overlay are shown here. These overlays specifically implement a couple of programs in the housing element. And so we want to make sure that we're capturing that as well as we update the zoning map. The higher density overlays in the blue, and the housing sites overlay here is in the purple. In terms of uses, we want to create uses that are kind of broad enough to allow for flexibility and broad enough that capture maybe many different types of uses. So I know one type of use I've seen in the past for other zoning codes is like a millinery shop. And for those of you that know, that's like a hat store or hat shop. We don't need to specifically outline every single very particular use. That kind of use would be something that could be categorized under retail or some sort of retail category, right? So we want to, again, kind of try to consolidate uses and allow for some breadth there so that if new uses in the future come about that we cannot anticipate, well, that our uses are written in such a way, or existing uses, that are allowed are written in such a way to allow for those future uses to be captured as well. And then also, where we can, we want to look at where we can be strategic to reduce conditional use permit requirements. Certain types of uses, may not necessitate a public hearing per se, right? And so that gets at kind of another recommendation that we have. But we propose to implement a minor use permit where for certain uses that may not have impacts that other uses may have, that may be able to be approved at the staff level. And then, of course, I mentioned consolidating uses. Of course, we want to define uses as well. In terms of development and design standards, there are different things that you can do for industrial uses or commercial uses. We talk about landscaping here, the facade, what that looks like, step backs where the second story may be set back a little bit more so the building doesn't look as imposing. These are different things that we consider in our recommendations. And then, of course, updating parking. So seeing where it may make sense to reduce minimum parking ratios, potentially for downtown, establishing maximum parking ratios. There are different things that we can do there. So, of course, we're taking a close look at parking. Otherwise, as part of this process, we have reached out not only to the Community Development Department and to the Planning Division, but we have talked to other departments, other divisions about their thoughts on what we need for the code. And so some of these things are reflected here. But in terms of development standards, we like to have that in a table. And then again, these are kind of very specific recommendations, but adding rear setbacks, minimum lot widths, different things like that. And then getting at administration and procedures here, I already mentioned considering the recommendation to consider adding a minor conditional use permit. We do recommend adding a temporary use permit and procedure for temporary uses. And then otherwise, as is typical for administration and procedures parts or sections of the code, we want to consolidate and organize things in a way that makes sense. So as I mentioned, of course, what we want to do here is hear from you all. And so we want to hear what you think about our recommendations for these various different items. So I've got just a couple more slides and then we will get into that. But in terms of next steps, what you can look for here in the future, as I mentioned, a couple of additional workshops or study sessions in the spring. And then, as I mentioned as well, we do anticipate adoption hearings about a year from now, July 2025. Otherwise, city staff has made themselves available Monday afternoons, so from 1 to 3 p.m. for anybody who wants to come talk to them about the zoning code and their thoughts of what they like, what they don't like, that kind of thing. And then again, the public review period aligning with those study sessions and workshops in the spring of 2025. So that's when we'll make our work on the zoning code public and we'll seek to gather more feedback there. And that's it. Again, Carol Kendrick is the project manager on the city side of things. So I know the city's working on getting project email set up, but please also coordinate with Kendrick if you have questions. And of course, I'm here and my team is here to answer questions that you have today as well. And that's it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, sir. Appreciate that. And so if we want to jump to the one section here on the presentation, it's on page 20. So it says discussion questions, and then you have a list of questions here that we can probably go through one at a time, I'd imagine, to help give staff some direction. Carol, did you have anything first to add to that?
Not at this time.
Okay, all right, thank you. And so if we got any questions from the commission or from council, either turn your light on or raise your hand so I can see that. I can't see the lights down below. And so with that, let's go to the first question of, do you agree with the code organization recommendations? And it's referred to section 2.1 of the report. And if you're looking at the agenda itself, that would be page 21 of 59. And we've got the code organization list that's there. And so to ask the group, are there any questions, suggestions, and so forth? And Jessica Flinch down there, do you have any questions?
No, I don't at this point. I do like the way I can just provide some feedback. I definitely appreciate the way in which it's a systematic approach and has been laid out to us in this manner, kind of outlining the five items that they're going to focus on. So code organization and making sure that we're in compliance. The zoning districts, I think, is something that we want to see with consistency across the board. Use regulations, and I wrote down a couple things with regards to adding clarity and kind of removing duplication. I think the easier that the code is to read, the better. And, narrowing it down to where there's not so much ambiguity is something that I'm definitely looking for with regards to that. I always like to hear also, I think I heard reduction in CUP requirements. So I think that that's good from a staff perspective as well, if we add that clarity. And I'm sorry, I could have been totally offline on your question.
No, it's fine. Okay, no, I appreciate the general comments and so forth, and so thank you for that. And I
Sure.
see Mayor Pro Tem Laura's got his light on.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. So, in keeping with the organization or trying to make it more sense, I was looking at, on the table, 1711 under general development. Would that not fit better under your performance or general development standards up with performance standards and landscape standards in your loading, parking and loading standards? So you have all your standards together
Oh, in terms of an order?
in terms of order, right? Or does it?
Yes, and I can speak to that. Thank you. So I will say, I don't know what page it is on your packet. It's page 12 of the recommendations
Right, page
report.
12.
Yeah, what we've included there is how the code is currently outlined and structured. So that's not how we're proposing to structure the code. And I will say that, yeah, general development standards, performance standards, landscaping, all of those things will be in what we will propose is to put those all in one division, which is kind of larger than a section, but one division of the code, because you're right, those all go together.
Okay, so if I can jump in.
Yeah,
So this is what's currently there, and then obviously we're taking recommendations to try to combine those.
okay.
Okay, all right, I got you. Back to you, Mr. Lar.
Okay, well then, just the zoning districts, obviously, and then the zoning map and zoning definitions, I think, should be moved to the top. So those would be my suggestions, and I don't know what you've already got planned to do, so I thought this is what you had proposed, and I was making suggestions on where to move those, or if we can.
Yes, and so thank you for that. So we will propose, typically with the zoning code, you'll have kind of an introductory or general division, if you will, at the beginning, right? And then right after that, what we typically propose is to have the zone regulations. So when it talks about the zoning districts, the zone maps, that's typically how we would propose that. And then I did allude to this in the presentation, but right now we do have an administrative draft in with staff of the proposed table of contents. And so that shows how we propose to organize the code. It's not really a public review draft at this point because we're still waiting to get staff input on that. But exactly what you've outlined, right? Those zone regulations are toward the top of how we
Okay.
propose to structure the code after that kind of introductory division.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all I have, Mayor.
All right, thank you, sir. Any other comments? Okay, so then I would assume that we will see then forthcoming a revision of that with that reorganization of the standards being more at the beginning. Hopefully I don't go down a rabbit hole on this one, but on where it says chapter 17.12 for adult entertainment, I assume that's like cigar lounges, bars, and so forth. Is that correct?
Not quite. There are particular statutes that relate to adult-oriented businesses, and so that's not just your typical bar. It's I don't know how to put it, but it's very, very particular, I guess. And so the city currently, in another title, regulates adult-oriented or adult entertainment businesses And so that is something that we'd likely have a cross-reference to, right? And then we would propose to put that in a section on called specific to uses. So when there are specific standards that apply to XYZ use, right, those would be outlined in that specific to use section. And so that's how we would propose to address that.
Okay, that makes sense.
adult
Yeah, I
independent
appreciate
ordinance.
that, because that seems such a small subset of what could potentially be out there, and an infrequent, review as well. Okay, and then are there any other comments from the group? Okay, do we have enough to move? Yeah, do we have enough to move forward on that? Okay, I think so.
Yeah,
All right.
yes, thank you. We're taking notes here as
Okay,
you
very
all are
good.
speaking,
Okay.
so this is helpful.
And then let me get back to my list here. So then, question number 2, do you agree with the zoning district recommendations? And that would be section 2.2 of the report. And so 2.2 begins, give me a second here, what page on the agenda?
Page 16 of the document or 25 of the agenda.
Okay. So I have a question then. So in the presentation that was given on pages 13 and 14 of the presentation, you identified, I'll call it a couple examples on each. Is this just a snapshot of what needs to be done and just pulling out some examples, or is that all encompassing of what was found that needs to be updated?
Yeah, so kudos to the city, kudos to staff. We did not find very many inconsistencies between the underlying general plan land use designations and the zoning. So these are 2 instances that we did find that were inconsistent, but otherwise most zoning in the city's zoning map is consistent with the general plan land use designation. I will say, you mentioned slide 13, which had the Mountain View Apartments and San Gorgonio Middle School. I will also say that we do recommend edits to the map as shown on slide 14, which are those overlay zones that are shown mostly for to accommodate to implement the housing element with those overlays. So we will be, in terms of base zones, we have not found too many inconsistencies, right? But in terms of overlays, we want to make sure those overlays are captured on the zoning map as well.
Okay, thank you. And were there any transit-oriented districts identified from the city or anything like that? Have we gotten there yet for that?
So we will, and that is another city overlay. So we will ensure that the transit-oriented district is included on the zoning map as well as we
Okay.
work through this project.
All right. Mr. White?
Yeah, can you just give a brief definition of what the overlay zones are and what they're for?
Sure. So the first 2, as I mentioned, the higher density overlay and the housing sites overlay. One of those has to do with including a minimum density. And again, this is to implement the housing element. It's 11 dwelling units per acre is that minimum density. Another one, the higher density overlay, has to do with increasing the maximum densities that are allowed. And again, that's outlined in the housing element. And then the transit-oriented district overlay, that's already existing. The city does have its that overlay already, but that is for areas also where additional density is allowed near transit.
So is it safe to say that an overlay is providing exceptions to the existing zoning underneath?
I would put it in the way of, well, yes, you can say that kind of generally. But I would probably say more of, it's an overlay is something that modifies, kind of as you mentioned, the underlying zoning in different ways. In these cases, it's to allow for, or it's to include, a maximum density, residential density, or a minimum density, particularly for those housing element overlays. Let me know if that's making sense or not, and I can.
So on your
Right,
map
so anyway.
here, on your presentation, page 14, I can barely see the streets, and what streets are bordering those overlay zones?
Yeah, sorry, that's small. So this is in downtown.
Okay.
So it's 6th and 8th Street is where the majority of those overlays are within.
And the street on the farthest east? What is that?
And if I may, I think that's between Allegheny and Xenia. Those were the housing element sites.
Okay.
This is, yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Jen was the director for the housing element update. So there you go. Nice person to have in the room. Thanks, Jen.
You good, Mr. White?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, any other questions from the group? Okay, so we in general consensus that we agree with what's been presented? Okay, all right. So then moving on to question number 3. Do you agree with the use regulation recommendations, and that is section 2.3? And so that begins on page 31 of the agenda. And as I was expecting, Mr. Laura, go right ahead. I was going to look to you, so thank you.
Yeah, 31 of the agenda, page 22 of the handout. I do like in the last paragraph where you're referencing the flex space, which I think is a great concept. Would we be looking at designating parking based on the most intense use when you look at those flex spaces like that? Is that the thought?
Yeah, so that's an insightful question. I think, there's typically a kind of general industrial parking rate that could apply here. But this is something that staff will have to work with the applicant to determine in terms of which industrial ratios should apply, right? So that's one possible way of going about it. What you've described in terms of kind of the most parking required. But there are a couple ways to address that. And again, what we've seen is that typically a general industrial parking ratio can work for flex spaces.
Okay, so would you have a table that identifies that to make it easier for the constituent to understand? Or is that something that you'd have to work through with planning staff? Or do you know at this point?
Yeah, so it would definitely be a table with the parking rates. Planning staff would work with the applicant to determine, which industrial kind of category, which industrial parking ratio would apply to their project. But it would definitely be all outlined in a table.
Okay, that's all I have, Mayor. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any other questions from the group? Mr. Martinez?
Yeah, just to clarify, so it says here that we're looking to reduce the minimum parking ratios citywide, but then establish maximum parking ratios in downtown. Is that the way I'm reading it, right? So I'm looking at the one slide here, slide 16, says that we're considering establishing maximum parking ratios in downtown, but overall we're looking at reducing the minimum parking ratios.
That's correct. Typically, and as you may recall through the housing element process, many cities in the United States have a lot of parking that isn't used all the time, right? And so we would look at ways to strategically reduce parking throughout the city in places that make sense. And there are different strategies that you can do. So for instance, shared parking, right? If there are say a restaurant and an office that are located next to one another, those types of uses have different peak demand times. They have different times where most people are going to be there, right? At offices, typically during the day people work and then they go home, and you don't need that parking for office at night, but say that restaurant at night could use that parking, kind of a thing. So we are looking at ways to strategically reduce minimum parking ratios in a way that makes sense. In terms of downtown, one thing that's been successful in other cities is, like it says on the slide that you identified there, establishing maximum parking ratios Typically, cities want their downtowns to be places that are more walkable, pedestrian oriented, get people outside their cars and walking to shops and restaurants and things like that. And so that's why we would recommend considering establishing maximum parking ratios in downtown. The last thing I'll say on this is that these are also recommendations that were in the parking management master plan that the city prepared. I think it was 2021. So we're getting our cues from that as well.
And you also said that the AB 2097 didn't affect the residentials in our case. Is that what I read?
I'm sorry, what was that?
The AB 2097, the requirement from the state for the parking, minimum parking establishments and stuff, that was referring to residential, is that correct? And therefore, it didn't apply to us anyway? Did I read that correctly in the report?
Well, so we are recommending, that the zoning code be revised to reflect AB 2097, and that recommendation is on page 7 of the report.
But remind me, is that referring to residential or for commercial?
Sorry,
Or
Jen,
both?
can you?
Oh, if I may, that does apply to all types of development, just regardless, located within half a mile of major transit. What I wonder in terms of applicability with the city is whether or where you have major transit stops. That might be where the city does not qualify or might not have any locations eligible. A major transit stop is the intersection of 2 or more major bus routes with a frequency of service interval of 15 minutes or less during the morning or afternoon peak commute periods. So where you've got 2 bus lines that intersect and they're on 15-minute headways during peak commute periods. If Beaumont doesn't have that circumstance, then you wouldn't have any location within the city where AB 2097 would apply.
Okay, all right, appreciate it.
All right, thank you. Any other comments?
Yeah, Mayor, back on the parking. So as we look at like shared parking, we'd obviously have to have some way of documenting or monitoring the shared parking in those instances. Because if you go from, you have a more intense use and a less intense use, obviously those could share parking. But if the less intense use moves out and you get an intense use, what I don't want to do is I want to make sure that we don't run out of parking at the same time, obviously. We do have some issues with, when you look at standards with warehouse parking, we've got semis and trailers that are being parked on city streets. I know that some of the issues we have with apartment, not having enough parking for apartments. And so I just want to make sure as we look at doing the ratios that we don't end up with forcing people to park on city streets. Well, and do the best that we can to keep them off with, when you have multifamily parking, as well as the big concern is the warehouse parking. So, thank you.
Point taken. Yeah, thank you. No, those are good points. Yeah, I will say there is because we have heard comments about concerns about semis and trucks being parked on city streets. I will say that is something that's addressed outside of the zoning code. So, so in terms of parking on city streets themselves, that's not something that we could address through updates to the zoning code. That is addressed in a separate title. But your point is well taken about having sufficient parking so that people aren't forced to park on city streets.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. Mr. Cooley.
I'm seeing, or I think I'm seeing you're talking about flexibility, but by the same token, we're talking about a spreadsheet and a tabular graph. We had a situation come up in planning where we were looking at a warehouse and the required parking spaces, we just flat out, it's this many. But when we looked at it and we talked with the developer, the issue was we were looking at a certain number of employees and assuming they were there all at the same time, when in fact it was 3 shifts and it was substantially fewer people. So those parking weren't needed for that time. And I assume that this kind of thing will be considered as well in making those minimums and having some flexibility.
Yes, thank you. No, that's a great point, and that gets at kind of what I was, or alludes to what I was talking about earlier in terms of different uses may have different parking needs. But your point is well taken that the same use may have different parking needs. I know in other places, prisons, right? Prisons have shifts where various shifts throughout the day where different correctional officers and other prison staff need to get there, right? But then say at noon or 3 o'clock or whatever it may be, all of them leave and then another shift comes in, right? So that is something that we are aware of and we'll consider as we develop the parking regulations, different shifts, right? They're all employees, but they may not all be at the same time. So that would influence the parking need. Great point.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. I'll jump in with a quick question. So we have it on here on page 34 of the agenda, which is 25 of the report. The top says establish a minimum lot width for residential, and I know you have examples of 60 to 75 feet. It was brought up by Mayor Pro Tem Laura in the past that some of our streets in our residential neighborhoods for the new tract neighborhoods are too skinny. And it's quite difficult when you've got, cars parked on both sides of the street and you're trying to get two cars passing each other. And so I'd like to see if we can have something in there for a street width for residential in there, if we all feel that that's appropriate. And then another comment that I see, and with my day-to-day job, is, and I don't know where this design comes from, if it's something that's in the code already and the city requires it or not, but I see it across multiple cities. When a home is plotted on a lot, where the garage is tends to be on the skinnier side of the side yards. So my interpretation of it is it's preventing RV and boat parking and so forth behind gates. But what we're running into now is more ADUs. And so we have tight side yards or areas that someone cannot extend an existing driveway. And so if somebody had a two-car garage but had some extra side yard space on that same side, they may have better access to and from an ADU in the back, may be able to squeeze a third car in the driveway and help then ultimately prevent more cars being parked in the street. And if we have wider streets, that would help too. And so I wanted to bring that up to see if that was something that we felt that should be considered and go in there as well. Any comments from the group on that, or from yourself, sir? Go ahead.
Sure, yeah, I don't want to interrupt if anybody else has anything.
I think you're good.
Okay, thanks. So I will say that the establishing the minimum lot width for the single-family residential zone, that is a recommendation that we heard from staff. I think you're right. It is important to think about where things like ADUs, and garages could go. I will say though, on the street widths, that's not something that the zoning code would address. I know there is a title that the city has, regarding streets and subdivisions and things like that. So that would be where street widths would be addressed. The zoning code and the zoning map typically just regulates parcels of land, but not the streets themselves.
Okay, all right, I appreciate the information.
I didn't, Mr. Mayor.
Ms. Craven, go ahead.
I didn't want to beat a horse to death, but I want to go back to that parking because downtown, it's more anecdotal, but during the event that we had just recently, I walked around just to see about parking, and the shared parking really has to be defined if we're going to go down that path, because I could easily see a problem with some contention about what parking is mine, what parking is yours, because there were people who didn't even park in certain areas because there were signs that said private parking that I saw in one area. And so I saw a lot of people parking on the street. So I understand the concept of the shared, but I think we're opening up ourselves a little bit on that. And I know that the event that we had on Thursday was a special event which required more parking availability, but I'd probably guess that this happens more often than not. Especially, I know there's a restaurant that I can't even understand where their customers park, right there on the corner of 6th and Beaumont Avenue.
Understood, okay. And so something like that, so when it comes to details of that, then we have maybe staff look at things and have a proposed plan and recommendations and so forth that go along with it. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So thank you for bringing that up. That's something to be sensitive to. Of course, you know, we want to keep in mind things that could be unintended consequences, right? Which is something that I think you're describing. So yeah, we will take that into consideration as we start to draft the code.
And one other thing, since we're talking about ADUs, and I looked at the document, the exhibit that you provided in your presentation about an ADU, but I would ask that we probably go, and I know I'm going into the weeds, but a little more in depth, because if I'm looking at that ADU, especially in a terrace lot configuration, I think that would be hard for the public to discern what their possibilities are with that ADU. I live in a terrace lot configuration, and looking at that, I could easily argue that I have an ability to set back my ADU, which will give me a greater height configuration, especially when there's an elevation difference of 12 feet plus the 6 feet of fence to the upslope house. So I would ask that, and a lot of the setbacks too, because I think the setbacks would help individuals decide on that. And the other concern I have is, I know the ADU should solve some housing issues. My concern is, how does that reflect with Airbnb? And would that be an issue that we have ADUs that really aren't solving our housing issue, but it's more catering to individuals that have that opportunity based on their lot size?
Yeah,
So
Oh,
if
sorry,
I
go
could
ahead.
further clarify, so then potentially that people may be using ADUs for the Airbnbs.
That's a concern I have.
Okay.
So to that point, I will say that some cities adopt what's called like a short-term rental ordinance, right? That is not something that we're scoped for as part of this zoning code update. If that's something that the city's interested in, you know, we've done those before, and we'd be happy to do that. But that's the way that some cities regulate, you know, short-term rentals, things like Airbnb, right? Is through a particular ordinance. And then on the height thing, you know, that's a good point. I will say, yeah, that graphic was just supposed to be illustrative of different ways to measure height, right? And with graphics to support. But yeah, that's something that we'll look at. And then, yeah, I will say that, of course, as you know, ADUs, a lot of that regarding setbacks, height, right, is set by state law. But where we can, you know, we'll look to have rules that make sense, you know, specific to ADUs.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. So, Mr. White, go ahead.
Yeah, back to the parking downtown. Carol, right now, we've had a discussion about this a couple times over the last couple of years, I would say. And I think at one point we took an approach, not a moratorium, but we relaxed our parking restrictions downtown. Can you speak to that?
We have a moratorium currently
Okay.
in place. I believe it's until next year. So, correct. And so the intention was to get the zoning code update across the finish line and address the parking needs in the downtown. So there is a current moratorium on parking in the downtown.
And explain what the moratorium on parking allows or doesn't allow.
It does not require the planning department to require parking for projects.
Okay. And so I bring that up because I understand some of the discussions about the downtown parking, but I think we had, we wanted to see an approach that would make it easier for businesses to come in, maybe businesses that would not be able to come in with our current parking standards. And that's why we started looking at the idea of shared parking and being a lot more flexible with which parking spaces go with which business. So I just wanted to bring that up so that the team that's working on this understand that I think was the direction that the council wanted to go. So that's all I had.
We currently have in our municipal code, it requires a shared parking agreement. So when we do have businesses that want to share parking, we do have an agreement in place. So we'll look at probably adding more teeth to that to where it, actually defines spaces, but that is noted.
Okay, thank you. So do we have enough direction to move forward on this one? We good? Okay, and then so,
Mayor, I have a quick
uh-huh,
question on the next steps in the process moving forward. It seemed like what we saw today was just a very small amount of information that you guys wanted direction on. Is this going to be the same in the next one, or are we going to get more detailed? Or how does the process evolve with these dates that we have?
Yes, thank you for that question. So yeah, this is an introduction to our recommendation report. We wanted to get kind of a temperature check and see, what your all thoughts were on these recommendations. But I will say that in the next workshops or study sessions, you'll be looking at the zoning code itself, right? Which we want to make as short as possible, but likely hundreds of pages, right? Very, very detailed. It's going to be the actual code language, the public review draft of the zoning code itself and of the zoning map. So at that time, we'll be able to get very, very detailed on all of these items.
Okay, great. Thank you.
all right, thank you. So last question then, do you agree with the administration and procedures recommendations at section 2.5, which is starts at page 25 of the report, which is 34 of the agenda packet? And any comments or questions from the group? Mr. Martinez, go ahead.
Yeah, it was just a couple of things in there. So I do support the gas station separation. I had mentioned this back a few years ago, trying to design the city to where hopefully we weren't becoming overwhelmed by convenience store, gas station type things on prime properties within the city, especially as we start getting more limited. Council pushed back on that. They didn't agree with that at the time, but I do believe that 1,000 feet separation would kind of help alleviate the congestion of that. So I do support that. I'm not sure what the setbacks of outdoor accessories means, so I was asking if you can elaborate on that. I know it's specific. I don't know if we're getting into specifics now, but I didn't know what that meant. You had a recommendation on your on the report about that. Design
This is
standards.
Jen. I can speak to that.
Just briefly.
In this case, we had conversations with city staff about issues with administering the code or finding areas where there wasn't enough flexibility to accommodate desired accessory uses and ensuring that they were appropriately screened as well. So things like the pool equipment and barbecue islands came up as, I think, some reoccurring requests that have possibly been problematic as they're processing building permits and requests. So I don't think this is a major issue, but where we can make tweaks to help address some of the issues that city staff has experienced with applications for those types of improvements, we just want to accommodate those.
Again, I assume this is one of those items we'll talk about more specifically later on one of the other workshops. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right, then I'll hold my comments for that too. My only other comment had to do with the height of mixed residential units or high-density units, multifamily, I guess is what it's called, multifamily residential units. Do we have a zoning, standard for that right now? As far as how many stories? I'm looking at stories, I'm not looking at height, I meant.
I know that the general plan sets forth heights for different land use designations. I don't have those heights off the top of my head, but in terms of our recommendation in the report, is to align with the zoning districts with the heights that apply in those land use designations. So again, it's consistency between the general plan and the zoning itself. Unfortunately, I don't have those height numbers here at my fingertips.
It sounds like we'll be getting to more specifics at another workshop, so that's something I'll be bringing back to look at, just to make sure. I'm concerned because I know we have possibly large, developments coming in, and I just want to see how that would affect that. I think that's all I have. I think a lot of my questions had to do with specifics, and it doesn't look like that was for this workshop. So things like the, what do I have written down? The pre-zoning for unincorporated territory and stuff, is that stuff that we get to at a later time on discussion?
Yes, and
Okay.
I will say, we had received some of those questions in advance as well. So that's a very astute question that you had brought up regarding pre-zoning. So currently, the city's general plan has land use designations for parcels that are outside of the city, but within the city's sphere of influence. So they have a land use designation, but they're just not pre-zoned currently. So our recommendation would just be to close that loop, to add a pre-zoning section that says that these parcels outside of the city boundary, but within the city's sphere of influence, would be pre-zoned to align with the underlying general plan land use designation.
Okay, and that discussion can come at a later time as well, correct? A specific,
Yes.
okay.
Yes,
Right.
but that is how we would approach to
Right, and I
recommend to approach that.
and so far I support that, so I just want to see what the wording is in the general plan and how we
Yes.
plan to align for that. So that's all, Mayor, thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. Mayor Pro Tem.
Yeah, just really quickly, back on setbacks, those recommendations are gonna come from staff, correct, on the minimum side yard setbacks and things like that? Minimum property widths or recommended property widths, and would that be recommendations?
That's correct,
from-
but we're going to work with LWC and their team as they've done many of these, so also getting their expert advice. But we know the challenges that we have here in Beaumont.
Perfect, thank you so much. Very detailed report, thank you so much, looking forward to next meetings.
All right, thank you, sir. Mr. White.
Yeah, just to sort of, I was, triggered's the wrong word, but I was triggered about the gas station. So if we look at these other development design standard recommendations, and we tell you, as we've already had, that we're good with what you're suggesting here, does that mean the 1,000 feet between gas stations is going to be in the code at this point, or do we need to give more discussion into those kinds of issues?
No, so I'll say you're going to get several bites at the apple. Of course, we don't have the authority to adopt anything, right? It's the
Right.
Planning Commission's recommendations and the City Council ultimately who will adopt the code, in whichever kind of form that they see fit. As was alluded to earlier, the separation is between gas stations is a recommendation. That's something that we've implemented in other communities that are concerned about kind of an over-concentration, as was mentioned, of gas stations, convenience stores, that kind of a thing. So that is an approach that has been taken in other communities. But that's not to say that that's the end-all, be-all, what we most definitely have to do in Beaumont, right? That's just a recommendation. But then when we do come forward with the actual public review draft of the zoning code, that's something that we can look at, and any of this stuff, can be modified as you all see fit.
Okay, because I just want to make sure that if tonight was a speak now or forever hold your peace, that I speak now.
Yeah, good
So,
point.
but if I have another shot at this, yeah, I'm definitely on the gas station. I'd like to see where that, if we had 1,000-foot separation in place for 30 years, where would we not have gas stations at this point? I think that'd be a good idea to understand, because I'm thinking of specifically Chevron and the Circle K on Oak Valley. That may be within 1,000 feet of each other, but I don't think that those two gas stations are an issue. So anyways, I think the discussion we had in the past was, if the market demands, in other words, people say no more auto parts stores, no more dollar stores, but if the market demands those, I don't want to put in zoning, I don't want to put in rules that say we don't care what the market needs and what the market wants. We're going to make sure that we have 3 auto parts stores and that's it. That kind of thing. What's that? Or gas stations, same thing. I just don't want to be put in a place where, most gas stations I go to in Beaumont are packed. There's plenty, and they're opening them up because there's a market for it. So, anyways, I will hold my peace for now.
All right, so just then to confirm, we're all okay with the Administration and Procedures recommendations, correct? Oh, Mr. Cravo.
Yes, I'm okay, but I just have a quick question. On the modifying the landscape plan regulation, are you talking about fuel modification zones on that?
Fuel modification is typically like in, is a fire concern, right? So typically, Jen, unless, there's something that that I don't, I see typically that kind of fuel reduction concerns in another part of the code. Not to say, anyway, Jen, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, this recommendation just, oh, and Carol, sorry to step in, just, these came in conversations with the fire department. We want to ensure that the landscaping requirements are in line and work in tandem with fire department, so there aren't hiccups for saying a landscape plan approved by planning, and then as it goes over to fire, it gets rejected. So we just want to ensure continuity there and streamlined for the applicant.
And we've seen that in the past. We approve landscaping plans and some of the trees or some of the other landscaping items are not consistent with the fire code. So just making sure that we're working together so it's easier on the applicants to where we don't have to come back and say, you have to modify this.
So this, so if it's a fuel modification zone, and I know I'm going into the weeds again, would this be something that staff would then ensure that the fire department or a part of the approval process is an annual inspection? And the only reason why I said this is because that's what brought me to city council, because I had a fuel modification zone that I had to fight for. And so it wasn't being inspected, and that was the concern I have, especially given the area that I live in, which is right off a canyon.
I know we're working on having annual inspections, so that's something that that is on our priority list to get done. And then again, we are working closely with the fire department during entitlement process to make sure that we're establishing landscaping that's consistent with both planning's requirements and fires.
Okay, thank you. So I think we're good. I'd like to thank everybody. And was it Stefano? Is that how you pronounce it?
That's right. You got it.
Okay,
Thank you.
all right. Okay, and then Jen, thank you for being here as well. Planning Commission, thank you, staff, council, and we look forward to our next meeting, which we will go into the weeds a little bit more. So we will adjourn this workshop at 5:02.
Thank you.